Hello, human animal earthlings. It's great to have you joining us on Radio Free Georgia's In Tune to Nature program. I'm host Carrie Freeman, coming to you this time from the mountain town of Asheville, North Carolina, for our June 10th, 2026 show. This happens to be my mom, Cathy Packwood's birthday, and I'm excited today that we're going to be talking about a topic that my mom has become passionate about: microplastics. How and why society should end the production of plastics for the health of humans and other animals in our shared habitats, and how we can work individually in our homes and collectively as engaged citizens to create a healthier existence free from plastics, as even recycling plastics causes toxins, and I'm learning more about that. So it's time to replace this harmful petroleum product with something sustainable and non-polluting, as plastics are made of fossil fuels that add to the climate crisis. So a plastic-free future goes hand in hand with a clean energy future. To tell us about this Herculean effort is our guest, Lindsay Yerka, Senior Plastics Campaigner at Greenpeace. It's likely that you've heard of the prominent legacy environmental nonprofit group Greenpeace, who describes itself as, quote, a global network of independent campaigning organizations that use peaceful protest and creative confrontation to expose global environmental problems and promote solutions that are essential to a green, just, and joyful future. I like those three words together: green, just, and joyful. Their website is greenpeace.org, where you can see a campaign called Fighting Plastic Pollution that we'll be talking about today, including their political advocacy for a global plastics treaty from all nations. Welcome, Lindsay.
Hi, Carrie. Thanks so much for having me and happy birthday to your mom.
Thanks. Now, tell us a bit about your background, Lindsay, and your interests, like how you came to be the senior plastics campaigner at Greenpeace.
Sure. Thanks for asking. For more than 2 decades, I've been working to hold the plastics and petrochemical and fossil fuel industries accountable for their pollution and its impact on our health and the environment, using both science, policy, and advocacy and communications to help in that fight. I came to the issue actually. I moved from Arizona, a small mountain town in Arizona, to California to be at the beach. And within the first couple of weeks of living at the beach, I ended up in the hospital with a
Huh.
really intense infection. And um, after some intense line of questioning from my doctors, they determined that I had contracted a staph infection from being in the ocean, which, growing up
What?
had always been a
Oh,
place where I went to like heal a cut or, find this joy.
right.
So that led me to start working with Surfrider Foundation, which is a great organization that's largely volunteer led. They've got chapters all over. And through that work, I quickly learned that while plastics wasn't what had made me sick in the water, that was one of the main pollutants in our oceans. And that not only were these plastics and their related chemicals polluting our oceans and harming ocean wildlife, but they had a really intense impact on our health.
Right.
And so from that day on, I've been working on this issue.
Oh, I'm so glad that you're doing that, and I'm glad you got past that infection. Well, the reason I picked this Beyond Plastics topics for this show is that, as I mentioned, my mom, Cathy Packwood, is celebrating a milestone birthday today, and she's been reading about longevity and healthy eating, and that includes a desire to stop ingesting microplastics. Since the statistics are so shocking about the prevalence of microplastic pollution in all our bodies, including that of human babies in the womb. So, Lindsay, let's start our Beyond Plastic conversation with the health issues for us humans living in societies filled with plastic. How does that affect us?
Sure. I mean, as you mentioned, plastics are everywhere. They've become so ubiquitous in our environments that it's nearly impossible to avoid them, even when we're trying very hard to do
Right.
so. I think in order to understand why plastics are an issue, especially as it relates to health, it's really critical to understand what plastics are. And plastics are fossil fuels, oil and gas that is refined and cracked, and then combined with chemicals. And There are more than 16,000 chemicals that are used in the production of plastics, and more than 4,200 of those are known chemicals of concern, which means we know that they're highly hazardous to humans and to human health and the environment.
Wow.
A single polymer, which is like a type of plastic, can contain more than 400 chemicals. And those chemicals have been linked with cancer, with obesity, with diabetes, with cardiovascular disease, and infertility. Many of the plastics related chemicals are endocrine disrupting. Our endocrine system is a group of organs that do a lot of important heavy lifting in our body. And they regulate our temperature, they regulate our hormones, they regulate our fertility. And so these chemicals are impacting those very foundational systems.
Can I ask, when we hear about persistent chemicals, is that the same thing as these endocrine disruptors? Like PFAS, you hear a lot about that PFAS. I don't know if that's a different
So
thing.
that is a certain class of chemicals.
Okay.
They are related. They are
Okay.
a set of petrochemicals that are related to the plastics chemicals. Um, they are not. They also have a lot of intense health impacts, including
Okay.
some of this endocrine disrupting. But PFAS aren't the only bad chemicals
Okay. It's the
that
ones
are
we hear about. That's the one we hear about the most.
right, because they are this very persistent chemical that is only compounding. It's very hard for our bodies to process. Yeah,
So it might stay in our system a long time.
exactly.
And it seems like the we've been hearing a lot about the microplastics, like they're in our brains, like these tiny, tiny granules that are kind of everywhere. And and it's weird because we're not trying to ingest them, or we don't know how they're getting there. Or you wouldn't even think that you have plastic inside your body. But because it really doesn't biodegrade and it ends up looking like sand at the beach or something, it just seems to even be in all kinds of uh animals and humans included.
Sure. So, I think at one time people sort of thought plastics were inert and like stayed in their form. And I think we're learning that they are indeed not inert. And so, thinking of microplastics, I mean, yes, there are those like tiny slivers, and sometimes we've seen them under a microscope, but they can actually be nanoplastics and even smaller and invisible particles. Um, we think of the typical sources of them, but we also the there's our built environments are so full of plastic related items. Our A lot of our couches are covered in
Oh,
PFAS or made of polyester. A lot of the active wear on the market
okay.
is made of polyester, which is a form of plastics. Think about, so every time plastic is exposed to heat or acid or fat or like activity, it's impacting those molecules that are making up that item. And so when we think about washing our clothes in the washing machine or drying them in the dryer, those all are shedding microplastics into our lived environments. Our carpet,
Oh,
when we're shuffling our feet over them.
yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, the exposure is everywhere. And even when we can't see them, we are we are experiencing them.
And I was seeing on the Greenpeace.org site some articles about microplastics in baby food. Like
Yeah.
Gerber was mentioned, that's a popular baby food brand.
Yeah.
So certainly that's not intentional that plastics are in there, but like what was the findings on that?
So Greenpeace International had baby food tested, and specifically the baby food squeeze pouches, which are plastic and plastic lined,
Okay.
and found hundreds of microplastics in a tiny little serving of each baby food pouch that it had tested. Um, when you scale that up to what is actually in the entire pouch, like an estimated 5,000 microplastics per single baby food pouch of Gerber baby food. When we think
Wow.
about microplastics being everywhere, like that we can't even keep them out of baby food is really problematic, especially when you think about babies developing systems. They're developing all of these endocrine systems, their hormone systems, their organs that they will rely on for the rest of their lives. So the impact on these tiny developing babies is really yeah, considerable.
And even that baby, he or she, they may have been born with some plastics already because they're in a human mother's womb, and the mother inadvertently is exposed to plastics and has that. And so that is a fascinating and disturbing reality too, that they can't escape it even if you try to have a kind of a clean lifestyle or something. It's inescapable so long as our society has this product
Sure.
everywhere.
And it's not just the microplastics themselves, but the chemicals that were
Yeah.
associated with those microplastics or that those microplastics might be carrying or that have like released themselves from the microplastics into the bloodstream. So yeah, we're finding plastics and plastics related chemicals in our blood and placentas. So yes, exposure to these babies before they are even born.
Well, to avoid plastics, for many months now, my mom has chosen to boil the Metro Atlanta tap water that she and my dad drink. I mean, there's not a boil advisory. She's just choosing to do this, and she lets the boiled water sit, and then she skims off plastic residue on the top, which is sometimes visible, and she strains the water into glass jars. And that's an amazing amount of effort. Lindsay, what do you think about this and other ways consumers can reduce our consumption of plastic, like in our homes?
Sure, that is, as you mentioned, quite a tremendous effort that your mother is undertaking. And I understand the desire to really try and take hold of this issue and our exposure. And I think water is a really great one to think about. I am not a water filtration expert,
Yeah.
but I do know that water can be a great source of both microplastics and other plastics related chemicals. I have found the Environmental Working Group to be a really great resource on what your local contaminants might be and how you can filter out not only those microplastics, but maybe some of the other chemicals that your municipal water supply might contain. I think, a really important step is to avoid single-use plastic water bottles,
Right.
even better plastic water bottles, them, altogether. That's just like a really simple exposure that is pretty constant, thinking about how much water you're ingesting every day or should be.
Yeah.
I guess what I want to say here is it really shouldn't be on moms
Yeah.
or families or individuals to be taking such painstaking efforts to just make sure that the water that we're drinking feels safe to feed ourselves and our
Right.
families. We need cities and states to be filtering these out from municipal sources.
Yeah.
Um, and in order for that to happen, which is quite expensive, we need the companies that are putting these plastics in our water source to be paying for that. And then we need measures that prevent it from getting there. That's what I
Right.
mean.
Like, so it's really a systemic problem, even though there may be things that we're trying to do in the meantime in our homes. Because, like, I had given her a water purifying system. It's the same one that I use that just kind of sits on the counter and you pour water into the top, but the container itself is plastic. And so that's why she doesn't really want to use that anymore, even though it's good at filtering out a lot of residue and other chemicals.
Mhm.
So I guess I don't know. What do you think about that? Like even if you're trying to purify
Sure.
your water, I mean, I guess you can sometimes attach something to the faucet itself and then use a glass jar as opposed to having a water filtration canister that is plastic.
Sure. So I understand the conundrum.
Yeah.
There are some that there are some water filtration systems that have stainless steel canisters or have done their best to eliminate the number of plastic items in the apparatus. So I think
Yeah.
that's an interesting thing to explore. I do think, while I said I'm not an expert on this, I do think that the studies have shown that even if it is a plastic container, you're still getting less exposure by virtue of filtering your water than
Yeah.
if you weren't. So, something to consider.
So, okay, that's what I was thinking. And it also is good if you don't heat things in plastic. And that's why we're concerned sometimes if you have beverages that are like water bottles in plastic containers, because you don't know if at one point in the process from the manufacturing plant to your house, or if they were sitting in your car, that they got heated in the sun and more plastic kind of leached into them. And then so many of our microwavable foods come in plastic containers, and then they instruct you to, put a little slit in the plastic and then stick the whole thing in the microwave for 4 minutes. And it's hard to find microwavable meals. Some of the organic ones are in paper, but I mean, a lot of them aren't. So I guess I just wanted to ask, is that one of the main things that we should be trying to do in our homes is avoiding like at least heating things up in plastic?
100%. I think the data is making it really clear. Like I said, plastics aren't inert. So when you add heat, it makes all of those little molecules very excitable and then they move around. And so
Yeah.
think about the heat as sort of like shaking that up. It's same with wear and tear, like reusing plastic Tupperwares over and
Mm.
over can just sort of disrupt that state of that item. So I always like to reference, I really loved the cookbook Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat. And if you go by that, like the salt, fat, and acid and time are all sort of like agitators of these plastic items. So avoiding heat, if you've got a microwavable dinner, before you throw it in the microwave, maybe take one extra step to throw it on a plate.
Yeah,
Um,
take it out of the container, put it on a plate, and then put a
yeah.
napkin over it or something.
But we've seen also the studies of like the hot coffee cup, which is even if it's paper, plastic lined, and like
Um,
thousands and
so,
thousands of microplastics released on that single hot coffee cup or
oh
a hot
man.
tea
So
bag. Yeah.
if you are going to get coffee at a coffee shop, it may be good to bring your own metal container or something so that if they'll accept it, so that or then when you're reheating the coffee, take it out of the plastic or the paper cup that's lined with plastic before
Yeah.
you reheat it. And it seems like we all should be trying to find all these linen bags, cotton bags for having our vegetables and everything in that and fruit from the store, and then like for taking our leftovers instead of recycling the old yogurt containers or something. Like we should be using glass jars, like the spaghetti jars is what my mom uses, or a pickle jar usually is a glass jar.
Mhm.
And you clean it out really well and you use that to keep your food in.
Love that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think a lot of
Yeah.
times we can think about the best option, which would be like going and like redoing all your Tupperware. But yeah, you're buying a lot of items that are coming in a glass container that you might be just recycling. And while glass is very recyclable, it also can just be straight reused in your kitchen.
Yeah.
I love
Yeah.
taking a peanut butter jar, like a cleaned out peanut butter jar to the coffee shop. I always have old peanut butter jars in my car and in my
Oh,
bike
you
just to
put
sort
your
of have, yeah,
hot coffee can go in there.
yeah.
Oh, okay. That's
Yeah.
interesting. All right. That's a new one for me. Now, okay, we've talked about human animals, but how are other animal individuals and their habitats harmed by the human mass production of plastics and all the resulting pollution? Like, especially for wild animals.
So, I guess just zooming out a little bit, plastics are at the center of a triple planetary crisis, which means they're impacting climate change, biodiversity loss, and air pollution. All of these systems which are impacting humans, but also wildlife. And as we mentioned, plastics are derived of fossil fuels themselves, hence, like, really being part of the climate crisis. In fact, like plastics and petrochemicals are really the industry's plan B as we start to shift to alternative energies. Um, it is projected that plastics and petrochemicals, which are their building plastics building blocks, will be the single largest driver of growth in the world's oil demand,
Oh,
accounting
no.
for almost 50% of the growth in oil demand through 2050. So this is a really big contributor to the climate crisis.
Yeah, like
Um,
we're all trying to shift, like, or some of us are trying to shift towards clean energy, like wind turbines and solar and different things. But even if we do that, so long as we still have plastic, the fossil fuel industry will still be drilling for oil and gas and creating all kinds of oil spills and mess.
Yeah. So when you think about the impact that plastics may be having on wildlife, I think a lot of us go immediately to like the straw in the turtle's nose or like there was a really famous picture by an artist, Chris Jordan, of he studied the albatross seabirds, and there would be pictures of these seabirds, their bodies like mostly decomposed, so you could only sort of see the skeleton of their stomach and full of plastics. So while the
Yes.
body was decomposing, all of these microplastics were still very much intact, and these animals were dying of starvation because they had ingested so much plastic that they weren't getting the nutrients that they needed, and their bellies were full. So there's those visible impacts
Right.
and environmental impacts that these animals are experiencing and wildlife experiencing. But then there's also these invisible impacts from the extraction of the fossil fuels to the climate impacts that that has, to the air pollution
Mm,
impacts that that has. The entire plastic supply chain is having massive impacts on biodiversity loss and
wow.
habitable zones. When we look at how those three are interacting, it's almost impossible to see any species that's not going to experience impact of the plastic supply chain.
Right. And I always like to mention wild or other animals just because they're an innocent bystander who are paying the price for the human pollution. I mean, we're all in a way somewhat innocent, but I feel like we as our species have are the ones that have to do something on behalf of other species. But well,
Sure. I think we see a lot of those impacts like at the sea. It's very visible, the bird who's got like the plastic chip bag in its mouth, the turtle with the straw, but even in the middle of the desert, Five Gyres did some great research where they looked inside a camel's belly
ah,
and or bolus, and it was just full of plastic bags.
oh my
So
gosh. Yeah.
there's no living being that is not being touched by this crisis.
Yeah, and especially since you said it also relates, since it plastic is made of oil and fossil fuels change the climate, and the changing climate is making it hard for animals to eat and live. Like there's just multiple factors. So I'm glad that you showed us the bigger picture there.
Mhm.
Well, Lindsay, one of the solutions some of us try is to recycle plastic products since plastic is constantly being thrust on us. For my entire adult life, over 3 decades, I've been trying to recycle, and I'm kind of like recycling police. And I notice most of my recycling is paper and plastic in terms of what I have the most of. And many weekends, me and a bunch of other people in Atlanta, including my neighbor Susan and my brother and sister-in-law, are at the Center for Hard to Recycle Materials, separating out all our number one, number two, number five plastics, and even plastics four and six, and those filmy plastic bags and the crunchy plastic bags too. And this plastic recycling represents a lot of time and effort on our part, cleaning it out and everything. But in Greenpeace's 2023 report titled Forever Toxic: The Science on Health Threats from Plastic Recycling, and I just found it on the greenpeace.org site, Forever Toxic. Greenpeace talks about the health problems that come with the process of recycling plastic. And I was really dismayed to hear about this. Can you tell us a little bit about the issues with recycling plastics and who especially gets harmed?
Sure, a lot to unpack there. And I think a lot of us at one point or another, even if it's not now, have been the recycling police in our house or in
Yeah.
our community. And that is not accidental, that is by design. The plastics industry actually came together in a very big way and mounted a large PR campaign called Keep America Beautiful that was aimed at specifically getting us to feel like the litter bugs and making us feel like it is our job to do all of this hard work to recycle and clean up this mess. And so that is very much by design, when in reality, unfortunately, less than 5% of plastics get recycled in the United States.
So 95% of plastics go in the landfill, basically. Yeah.
Or the lived environment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or just stay, yeah, around.
And there's a lot of reasons for that. I think a big reason is that virgin plastics are seen as cheap. And while they may be marketed as a cheap item. They are not, in fact, a cheap item to produce or have in our environment. And a lot of times they are cheap because our government is subsidizing them.
Mm.
In fact, globally, more than $80 billion in subsidies went to the production of plastics in 2024.
Oh, what was that number again?
80 billion
Eight.
globally
Okay,
went
globally, 80
$80
billion
billion
dollars.
dollars in subsidies
Mm.
went to produce plastics in
Yeah.
2024. And that number is expected to rise to almost maybe 150 billion by 2050.
Wow.
So this is a lot of government money that is going to keep those plastics, quote unquote, cheap, those virgin
Yeah.
plastics. So it takes a lot of energy to recycle plastics, which is going to contribute to that air pollution in terms of recycling and also just the cost. So it is often cheaper to have this heavily subsidized virgin plastics just sort of entering the market than to recycle plastics. For a long time, I guess at the beginning, before there was restrictions on exporting our plastic waste, there were second markets in other countries that were sort of buying these plastics and trading them. And so we were essentially waste trading and exporting the pollution. There are now restrictions on that. And so that's when we've seen recycling rates really go down. So, in terms of the health impacts, we talked about how many chemicals are going into plastics.
Right.
And when you recycle plastics, those chemicals don't go away. In fact, often they're adding additional chemicals to
Mm.
bleach or colorize or stabilize or harden those plastics when they are recycling them.
Yeah.
In fact, research has shown that recycled plastics contain elevated chemicals compared to virgin plastics. So
Uh,
PFAS in some cases, those forever chemicals,
yeah.
levels in recycled plastics were twice as high.
Even
Uh,
though we're trying to buy like plastic, we're trying to buy things made of recycled material, or sometimes we buy like bags and clothing. I'm like, oh, this shirt was made with recycled bottles. Isn't that cool? Maybe not.
so unfortunately, while closed loop systems and circular systems are ideal, they are not ideal when the input of that system is inherently toxic.
Yeah.
So until we address the toxic inputs and the chemical concentration or makeup of plastics, until that is addressed and we can ensure that those are healthy inputs, recycling will continue to have its unhealthy outputs. And unfortunately, the communities that are most impacted by that are communities that can't afford to buy a nicer natural like item versus a synthetic
Mm.
clothing. But more importantly than that, where these plastics are produced, where the fossil fuels are extracted, and then where the items are recycled, if they are recycled, are often happening on frontline and fence line communities, which are largely communities of low income, communities of color, indigenous communities,
Mm.
where all of these impacts are compounded, and the health impacts of that are being felt up front and center. We're seeing cancer rates in some of these locations up to 5 times higher than surrounding.
Horrible.
So
Yeah,
yeah,
and so
it's
it's an
really,
environmental, so plastics and even plastic recycling is a environmental justice issue, as they say. So I'm so glad that you mentioned that and that it was part of your Forever Toxic report.
yeah.
If you're just joining us on Radio Free Georgia, this is In Tune to Nature. I'm host Carrie Freeman, talking about efforts to create a future free of plastic for health and environmental reasons with guest Lindsay Yerka, Senior Plastics Campaigner at Greenpeace. Their website is greenpeace.org, and we've been talking about the toxins released in the process of recycling plastics. Lindsay, I realize the foremost solution will be for companies to switch to a sustainable alternative to plastics, and we're going to talk about that needed regulation effort in a minute. But in the meantime, for us as individual consumers, I know we should try to avoid buying anything made of plastic or in plastic containers. But we also discussed how that in reality is somewhat impossible because the corporations are just, the plastic is so cheap and they hand it to us right and left. So when we do inevitably end up with some disposable plastic products, should we just be throwing them away? Like, basically, is filling the landfill with plastic better than trying to clean and recycle the plastic products, given the toxins that the recycling process gives off? It kind of sounds like a lose-lose dilemma.
Really such an insane conundrum that that we have to like bend our minds around. Like, what is the
Yeah.
lesser evil here?
Yes.
It's really unfortunate. I guess I don't honestly have a clear answer for you. I will inform the question with this. There are different municipalities and areas that have different capacities for recycling, especially certain items. So, like plastics with the label 1 and 2 are often more recycled and more recyclable in most municipalities. So, it's if you're really like racking your brain over this, you can find information on what your local system is able to withstand. Like I said, because this industry is heavily subsidized, at least the plastics industry, as we see the fossil fuel and oil and gas supply chain get disrupted, like with the war on Iran, we will see rates in recycling change. So I guess this is to say that they can be in flux while they are across the board extremely and depressingly low, and that's probably not going to take an about turn. That could get a little higher or lower depending on how the market is looking. Recycling was never meant to be the solution. So continuing to rely on it is both what the industry wants us to do and is sort of like a distract and delay tactic. So
Right.
while it may be helpful to like keep some things in the system, also knowing that like it's not our job to make this less of an issue. In fact, we need to be making it more of an issue for the industry that is putting it in our faces.
I'm feeling like I think part of me psychologically is, oh yeah, I try to avoid plastics, but oh okay, well if some of the food that I'm buying, it might be organic and vegan and everything, but then it comes in plastic, and I'm trying
Right.
to weigh all these factors,
Yeah.
in terms of making decisions. But then I'm like, well, okay, I can recycle this plastic at least. That was my feeling. So
Mhm.
if in my mind I know might as well go in the trash, that also might make me even less likely to try to buy it, even though that may be that then
Sure.
I can't buy any kiwis or whatever it is that only comes in plastic.
Sure.
So yeah, but it's starting to make me rethink the amount of water and time and effort I'm using and even driving my car over to the recycling place, the specialty place, that
Yep.
maybe I shouldn't bother doing that, and there's better uses of my time.
Of your time and energy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, yeah. I think I always love, if there's a retailer or a grocery store that you frequent regularly, like every time I go in, I'm like, hey, I would have bought these today if they weren't wrapped in plastic. And so
Ah,
thinking about other points that you can put pressure on,
yeah,
um, or perhaps, leaving some of those strawberry cartons behind because it's
right.
really that's not our job to clean up. But yeah, I think there is a lot to calculate in that,
Yeah.
and it's too much for one person to really hold. I guess
Yeah.
the
I
other
was
thing I
gonna
wanted,
ask, like at Greenpeace around the office, even though realize some people may work remotely, like, do you recycle? I know you try to avoid plastic, but at the office at Greenpeace, do you recycle plastic there, or do you just throw it in the trash? Like, what's the recommendation to you and the staff?
so I'm a remote worker. I do
Yeah.
not work in the office, and so I couldn't tell you what is the norm at the office. I think there are actually within even just our team that focuses on plastic, people feel differently about this. There are
Okay.
some campaigners that actually feel that landfilling plastic is better because
Okay.
you're not perpetuating that toxic life cycle.
Right.
And then there are others that think that recycling the most likely to be recycled is still worth it. There are markets to be discovered for plastics, and so the
Hmm.
we're all over the map in terms of our individual practices, but the one thing that we are all decidedly pointed on is that this really should not be on an individual to hold this weight, and we've
Yeah.
got to hold the producers accountable.
Ooh, that's a great segue into my next question, Lindsay. So, okay, we've been focusing most of this In Tune to Nature show today on what we can do as individual consumers, at least to reduce the toxins from plastics in our lives, even though it's somewhat impossible. But now I'd like to shift to what we can do as engaged citizens acting collectively to pressure governments and corporations to finally stop producing plastic products. Lindsay, can you speak to that effort of anti-plastic or biodegradable plastic alternative campaigns that are kind of at the systems level?
Sure. I mean, so I will say that thinking about like who's making the big decisions. So there's the companies themselves that you can let know that you would like for the products that you're purchasing to change. There's the retailers that are selling you those products and letting them know that you would prefer alternative options and more closed loop systems. We're seeing some state level efforts, especially in California, some exciting things coming out. There's the truth in recycling law that prohibits companies from using those recycling slash chasing arrow on packaging deceptively. So
Okay.
unless it meets a certain threshold with like more than 60% of a location having access to that recycling mechanism, then they can't use those. And in one of our latest analyses, can you guess how many of the types of plastics those resin codes had that 60% threshold?
I don't know, 50%?
Zero.
What?
Yeah. So I think,
Oh God, that's terrible.
I
Because of
mean,
course we're all using those little arrows with the number in them. Oh, this says number two. I can recycle that.
yeah, those are resin codes, which are meant to just help people identify what kind of plastic it is, should it, in case it could be recycled. And so that is a very deceptive marketing practice that California is addressing. We're also seeing SB 54, which is an extended producer responsibility measure aimed at reducing single-use packaging by 2032 by
That's a Senate,
25%.
a bill in the United States Senate.
It's like state bill.
Oh, it's a
So,
state bill
yeah.
in California.
But when we look at California as a market and how it has the impact to sort of sway national markets,
Right.
that's a really big deal. I guess a little bit of good news is that more than 50% of the plastics that we're using are for single-use items, which are essentially non-required. This is not like your glasses or the airplane or the medical
Yeah.
devices. This is like
Computer and
low-hanging,
appliance. Yeah.
yeah, single-use products that might make life slightly easier, but that have all of these impacts. So even just reducing single-use and single-use packaging is going to be it's like the low-hanging fruit, and it's going to have a huge impact. Even when you're thinking about your individual life, addressing those single-use items is just a really good place to start.
But especially at our retailers, when you're at like the fast food or the like gas station and they're giving you styrofoam, for with your icy drink and all that stuff. You'd have to ask them, this be put in aluminum or something? I mean, a lot of places are probably not going to give you glass. I mean, I also think that's a hard thing because what we really need is a biodegradable plastic alternative because sometimes metal or glass isn't a good as convenient or glass is heavy and breakable and, all this kind of thing. And so sometimes you do see things that are made that are compostable and so like they look like plastic. So like can we upscale that? And is that what we're really wanting is something that functions like plastic but is non-toxic and biodegradable?
Unfortunately, I mean, I won't get into the whole biodegradable plastics, but a lot of them are not actually compostable. Even in an industrial composter, a lot of them are sort of getting recycled or like mixed in with recycling and sort of confusing that system. So while those might not be fossil fuel derived and they're better on that end, they're
Yeah.
not necessarily like the solution that is, they're still perpetuating that single-use convenience. And I think,
Yeah.
unfortunately, the real solution here is more closed loop systems where we are using a more durable good and we've got systems surrounding it, whether it be retailer or brand or citywide and municipality wide or statewide. systems that are being repurposed, not recycled, but like
Yeah.
used in their same form. And I think an
So not
exciting,
as much takeaway because we've all gotten really in the habit, especially in cities, of so much takeaway and delivery
sure. Or if
with
the
food
entire
especially, but
city of San Francisco has implemented a takeaway system where it's like a single type of container and there are readily available dispensers to both pick up
oh,
and drop those, and all of the retailers are using them, then that doesn't be, you can still have your takeout and a closed loop system. I think
wow.
the exciting thing about this sort of approach is that it means more local jobs
Yeah.
because you're handling and distributing those. It means a more resilient supply chain. We saw in COVID, and again, I think we're going to see as a result of this war in Iran, when a supply chain is so dependent on fossil fuels, and as plastics are, and that gets stopped up, an entire supply chain is just disrupted. And so when we have more locally resilient systems, we become more resilient overall.
Or
Um,
like independent from these
exactly.
the global system
Yeah.
that's reliant on fossil fuels. And I can see also that you're saying that governments have to get involved in making these systems work, or and also make creating a process of reusables or recycling of those non-plastic takeaway items so that all the businesses are on even playing field and it's not like, oh, one business spends a lot more money doing all this extra work to be eco-friendly than the
Mhm.
other ones don't, and everything's cheaper still. I just think that without government intervention, even though people don't like the word regulation, it's there for a reason because clearly the companies are just going to do business as usual and to continue to hand us plastic item after plastic item after plastic item, and then we're just stuck kind of, should I trash it? Should I recycle it? Like we're stuck with all of this
The,
unless governments get involved for the
the thing is,
purposes of the
the
environment
thing
and our health.
Yeah, the thing is that the governments have already intervened. They are handing out massive amounts of money
Mm,
to the virgin plastic producers. So they've
yeah.
already intervened. They're already here. I mean, the less intervention would
Yeah,
be
so we're
stop
doing corporate
subsidizing.
welfare right now, but like let's help out the consumers,
Yeah,
with the government if there's going to be government subsidies.
yeah.
Just real quickly, because we need to wrap up. I was reading about I think it's called the Stomp Act at the federal level that is promoting research on microplastics. I
Mhm.
was getting the impression that Greenpeace sees this more as a delay tactic, and instead it's not really preventing more plastic pollution from building up in our bodies and habitats.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think the thing with plastics are relatively new on Earth in our bodies. And so understanding them better, having more robust science around them is helpful.
Yeah.
What we're seeing, especially this administration, do is talk big game, promise these big things related to food safety, related to water safety, and like put a bunch of money behind new research when there's very simple steps that they could take right now to reduce our exposure. A lot of what that Stomp initiative is aimed at is trying to understand how much and what size and how many of the plastic particles are in our body, and then research whether we can remove them. And that's like trying to, you know, to clean up a flood one tablespoon at a
Yeah,
time.
right,
We
right.
need to stop the supply before we're trying to think about like cleaning it out of our blood, because tomorrow it's just going to get right back in there. And that's why I think the biggest and best thing and the once in a generation opportunity that we have, bigger than Stomp, is this global plastics treaty, which,
Yeah.
governments are working to establish an international treaty that Greenpeace is pushing for that treaty to really limit, Greenpeace and others, to really limit the amount of plastic that can be produced on the globe. And in addition, to address some of those problematic chemicals and ban those problematic chemicals
Yes.
so that if plastics are being recycled, they are not having that toxic impact. And I think, this is the single most important and effective way that we can really stop that exposure to our health and our environment where it's starting. which is
So
ethanol production.
that would be for our nation, the United States or any nation, to sign on to a global plastics treaty, but make sure that that global plastics treaty is not some watered down PR stunt and that it really does get rid of the chemicals and reduce the reliance on plastic. Because
Yes, we
also
need
you can clean up your one country, but we live in a world where it's gonna, plastics are gonna show up on your beach anyway. Like,
right.
so you can't, it has to be everyone.
It is a global
Yeah.
supply chain. It requires a global solution. And yes, we need an ambitious treaty, not one
Yeah,
that is watered down or that is focused on more recycling, because that's what we already have and it's not getting us what we need.
right. Well, Lindsay, to wrap up, since we've established how this business as usual increasing cycle of plastic production and pollution is deadly and massively unsustainable for all of us animals on planet Earth, we're basically drowning in plastic. What can any interested listeners do as engaged citizens to help our society transition to a plastic-free future?
Sure. I mean, there's the reducing single-use plastics in your day-to-day life is sure. It'll reduce your exposure and be like one of the easiest to tackle things. But I think more importantly, spending that effort and energy on the bigger lever points. So letting the grocery store that you frequent every day, knowing that you want different choices, letting the brands know
Yeah.
that you want different choices. I think thinking about changing these bigger systems, getting your state to take solutions that make your water cleaner and that hold the
Yeah.
polluting industries accountable. Honestly, we need people in power that are making decisions that put people over corporate profits.
Yes.
And we need to elect people that have our interests at heart, and we need to get money out of politics so that we can get those people in office making decisions for us.
Yeah.
So I think democracy is inherently wrapped up in how we address this.
Oh, I love, that bevy of different ideas and the depth that you and Greenpeace have used to approach this. Well, that's the end of our show, but I want to thank you, Lindsay Yerka, for being with us on Radio Free Georgia's In Tune to Nature program. Thanks for the efforts that you and your team at Greenpeace do to champion the cause of a plastic-free future by pressuring governments and corporations for responsible actions, such as with the Global Plastics Treaty.
Thank you so much for your time and for focusing on this. It was lovely to speak with you, Carrie, and happy birthday to your mom.
Thank you. That's what I was just about to get to. I wanted to wish my mom, Cathy Packwood, a happy birthday and thank her for inspiring me to do this plastic-free future show. And also thank her and my dad, because it's Father's Day coming up, for raising me and my brother to be responsible people who take care of ourselves and others, including other species. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning In Tune to Nature, broadcasting every Wednesday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, online at wrfg.org and on Atlanta radio station 89.3 FM. I record from Atlanta in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, in the Muskogee Creek territory and former range of the Red Wolf, now home to some coyote families and a million squirrels. I happen to currently be in the Appalachian Mountains with the black bears here in Asheville, North Carolina right now. You can access Action Items news and podcasts on the show's website, wrfg.org/intune to nature, or on our Facebook page. The views and opinions expressed on this show do not necessarily reflect those of WRFG, its board staff, or volunteers. I'm one of those volunteers. I'm host Carrie Freeman, asking you to please help financially sustain independent, non-commercial media like Radio Free Georgia at wrfg.org. Who else has the freedom and passion to be so radically candid? And remember to take care of yourself and others, including other species, who all want to live without plastic pollution in and around us. Thank you for listening. Cheers.